At 7:42 a.m., under the pale tropical light of New Guinea, a young mechanic crouched beneath the silver wing of a P-38 Lightning. The air around him hummed with distant engines and the soft echo of surf rolling somewhere beyond the jungle. His name was James McKenna, and like most men in that small patch of airfield, he had learned to hide his worry behind calm movements. Across the tarmac, his pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, climbed into the cockpit, calm, focused, 23 years old, and flying a mission that everyone silently feared might be his last. McKenna wiped a streak of oil from his hand and watched the propellers spin to life. The twin booms shimmered in the morning haze, glinting like polished metal under a sun that rose too quickly. Around them, the squadron prepared for takeoff, engines rumbling like a storm about to break. To anyone else, it was just another day of sorties and fuel checks. To McKenna, it was another morning of hoping his pilot would return. The P-38 was an engineering marvel. Twin engines, sleek lines, tremendous power at high altitude. On paper, it was a masterpiece. In the skies above the Pacific, it was something else entirely. A heavy machine struggling against the delicate, almost effortless agility of Japan's Mitsubishi Zero. The difference between the two wasn't measured in horsepower or weapons. It was measured in seconds. The tiny, fatal delay between the moment a pilot moved the control stick and the moment his aircraft responded. In a turning fight, that delay meant everything. The Zero could twist through the air like a bird, rolling inside its opponent's arc with a grace that no manual could teach and no engine could overpower. American pilots were trained not to engage in those kinds of fights. Never turn with a Zero, the manuals said. Use altitude, use speed, dive, and climb. Hit once, then leave. It was doctrine built on survival, not dominance. But even perfect doctrine could break when faced with perfect timing on the other side. For months, McKenna had watched pilots come and go, some confident, some nervous, all brave. They climbed into their Lightnings with the steady courage of men doing their duty, and too often, they didn't return. The official reports always said the same thing: operational error, tactical mistake, mechanical failure. But McKenna had worked on those same aircraft, checked their engines, adjusted their flight surfaces. He knew their every sound and vibration. And he had begun to suspect that the problem wasn't in the sky, it was hidden inside the airplane itself. He noticed something that no manual mentioned, something small enough to seem trivial. When he pulled on the aileron control cables that ran through the Lightning's long twin booms, there was a faint give, not enough to measure by sight, but enough to feel. The cables were within factory tolerance, according to the engineers, but that tolerance meant a subtle slack. When the pilot moved the stick, the control surfaces hesitated, only for an instant. Yet in a turning fight, an instant could mean the difference between evasion and being caught. McKenna had raised the issue weeks before, bringing it up to the engineering officer. The reply was predictable. The aircraft met every specification, and changing anything without authorization would be a breach of regulation. Lockheed's engineers were thousands of miles away, and field crews had neither the tools nor the permission to modify flight systems. But that answer didn't sit right with him. He wasn't an engineer, he was a mechanic, and mechanics live by what they can feel in their hands. Something about that slack told him the Lightning could be more than it was: faster to respond, sharper in a fight, alive in a way the manuals didn't imagine. That morning, as Hayes rolled toward the runway, McKenna found himself gripping a piece of piano wire he'd taken from a damaged aircraft weeks earlier. It had been sitting in his toolbox, bent and scratched, useless, or so he thought. He didn't know yet that this thin coil of steel would soon alter the rhythm of air battles across the Pacific. He only knew that his pilot needed a miracle, and that official channels had offered none. The Lightning roared down the strip, the air vibrating with power. McKenna watched the plane rise, its silver wings cutting cleanly through the sunlight until it became a distant glint above the tree line. He stayed there long after the sound faded, feeling the weight of everything he couldn't control. The sky swallowed airplanes, and he had begun to understand that no amount of grease or wrenches could fix that, unless he broke a few rules. The Pacific War had a cruel way of teaching lessons. The American P-38 Lightning was supposed to dominate the skies. It was faster, tougher, and armed with enough firepower to slice through enemy formations. Yet over the jungles of New Guinea, the aircraft that once looked unbeatable had become a question mark. Every pilot loved its speed but feared its sluggish response when the fight slowed down and turned into a circle of spiraling duels. The Japanese Zero, by contrast, seemed almost alive. It could twist and climb like smoke in the wind, turning inside the radius of any American fighter. Veteran Zero pilots had learned to draw the lightning into a trap, let it chase, then roll tight and cut across its path. The heavier P-38s simply couldn't follow. By the time its nose came around, the Japanese fighter was already behind it, firing short, accurate bursts. Over and over, the story repeated itself. Doctrine told pilots never to engage in that kind of turning match, but doctrine faded quickly in the noise of battle. Each returning mission told the same quiet story. Pilots who survived described the same strange feeling. The aircraft didn't respond quickly enough. There was always that half-second lag, that soft, almost invisible pause between moving the stick and feeling the wings bite the air. For those who never came back, the reports ended with the same line: pilot failed to maneuver. To headquarters, it was a statistic. To McKenna, it was a pattern. He kept a small notebook where he wrote down aircraft numbers and the tension readings of their control cables. The values were technically fine, always within tolerance. But as the weeks passed, he began to hear it, a distinct metallic twang when he tested each line by hand. Some sounded tight and crisp, others dull and muted. The difference was subtle, the kind only a mechanic would notice, but to him it felt like the heart of the problem. Every morning, before the first flight, the maintenance area came alive with motion. Tools clattered, air compressors hummed, and mechanics moved between aircraft like surgeons preparing for an operation. McKenna worked quietly, his hands darkened with oil, his thoughts fixed on the small details that others ignored. He wasn't thinking about medals or recognition. He just didn't want to see another empty bunk in the barracks that night. He remembered one pilot in particular, a young man named Parker, who had trained alongside Hayes. Parker had energy and a grin that never faded, even after long days in the tropical heat. When his aircraft went out that morning, it was running perfectly, engine timing flawless, wings clean, everything signed off by the book. When Parker's plane didn't return, the official paperwork blamed the pilot. McKenna didn't believe it. The machine had betrayed him by being just a little too slow. That belief began to grow into certainty. The P-38's complex twin-boom design meant that its control cables ran long paths through pulleys and fittings. A fraction of looseness anywhere in that chain introduced delay. At high speeds, the airflow masked it. But in tight maneuvers, when the aircraft slowed and every fraction of control mattered, that delay turned fatal. McKenna brought it up again, this time to a senior engineer visiting from command. The man listened politely, nodded, and repeated the same words he'd heard before, within specification. There was even talk of factory warranties and how unauthorized modifications could void them. The conversation ended with a shrug. Regulations were clear, and war didn't give room for experiments. But out on the front line, reality didn't care much for paperwork. Pilots were improvising every day, changing tactics, bending the rules of combat just to survive. McKenna began to think maybe the same rule should apply on the ground. Maybe saving a pilot didn't always mean following procedure. In the evenings, after the noise of the base faded, he would sit outside the maintenance hangar and watch the orange glow of sunset reflect off the parked aircraft. Their silver skin caught the light like rows of sleeping giants. He'd listen to the crickets, the faint buzz of generators, and think about how many small mistakes were hiding inside those machines. The manuals written thousands of miles away didn't account for humidity, for dust, for the way salt air worked its way into every hinge and cable. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about physics, the invisible world of motion and resistance that decided who came home. McKenna's instincts told him the solution wasn't complex. It was mechanical, something that could be fixed with the right tension, the right feel. He just needed the courage to act on that thought. Hayes, meanwhile, kept flying missions. Each time he returned, his expression hardened a little more. He'd land, climb down from the cockpit, and walk straight to McKenna. They didn't have to say much. One look was enough to understand that something had to change. Hayes wanted his airplane to respond the way he did, instantly, decisively. He didn't want another flight where his hands moved faster than his machine. McKenna promised he'd find a way. But he didn't yet know that the idea he was searching for was already sitting at the bottom of his toolbox, in the shape of a simple piece of wire. That night, the airfield slept under a sky full of stars, the jungle humming softly around the perimeter. The distant sea breeze carried the smell of oil, dust, and damp earth. McKenna stayed behind in the maintenance hangar long after the others had gone. The lights buzzed weakly above him, flickering in the tropical humidity. It was nearly midnight when he made his decision. The thought had been building for weeks, growing heavier with every empty bunk, every mission that ended without a return. He had tried the official route, written the reports, spoken to the officers. None of it mattered. The answer was always the same: specifications are correct. The system worked, except for the part where pilots kept disappearing from the sky. He stood beside Lieutenant Hayes's P-38, the metal still warm from the day's heat. The aircraft looked peaceful and quiet, a sleeping beast unaware of its own flaws. McKenna ran his hand along the wing, feeling the smooth rivets and cool skin of aluminum. He opened the inspection panel on the left boom, his flashlight cutting through the dark. Inside, the network of cables and pulleys gleamed faintly. He tugged gently on one of them. There it was again, that slight give, almost nothing, but enough to feel wrong. He pulled a small box from his tool chest. Inside were bits of wire, pins, and fittings scavenged from damaged planes. Among them lay the 6-inch length of piano wire he'd kept for no reason other than habit. It was strong, springy, and perfectly smooth. The idea came together in a moment, not a flash of genius, but a mechanic's instinct. He could use it to add tension, just enough to remove that subtle slack. McKenna measured carefully, bending the wire into a shape that would act like a spring under pressure. The metal fought back. It was stiff and sharp. His pliers slipped once, cutting his thumb, but he barely noticed. The steady rhythm of work pushed away everything else: fear, doubt, even fatigue. He was simply doing what felt right. When the shape finally matched the image in his head, he reached into the narrow cavity inside the boom. The space was tight, barely wide enough for his hand and the flashlight. Sweat rolled down his temple as he maneuvered the wire into place, connecting it between the control linkage and the pulley bracket. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't approved. But as he tightened the fitting, he felt the line go taut, perfectly taut. He pulled on the cable again, testing it by feel. No hesitation, no play. The control surface moved instantly. It was the way it should have been all along. For a moment, McKenna just stared at it, unsure whether he'd fixed the problem or created a new one. The modification was invisible once the panel was back in place. If anyone inspected it, they'd never notice, unless something went wrong. He cleaned the blood from his hand, wiped the sweat from his brow, and sat on the hangar floor. The sound of insects and distant thunder filled the silence. He had just broken more than a dozen rules in the maintenance manual. Unauthorized alteration of flight systems, use of non-standard parts, absence of engineering approval. Any one of those could end his career. But sitting there, looking at the gleaming P-38, he felt something like calm. For once, he had done more than watch. At dawn, the airfield stirred back to life. Mechanics fueled the planes, checked guns, and loaded ammunition. McKenna stood near the flight line as Hayes approached, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. The two exchanged a quick nod. Hayes didn't ask questions. Maybe he sensed something different, maybe not. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and ran through his pre-flight checks. The engines started with their familiar growl. The twin propellers spun in unison, the exhaust shimmering in the humid air. McKenna stepped back, hands on his hips, watching the machine he had quietly changed. The control surfaces moved during the pre-flight test, smooth, immediate. It worked, at least on the ground. Whether it would hold in the air was another story. When the signal came, Hayes taxied to the runway. McKenna watched every movement, the flaps lowering, the nose lifting, the wheels leaving the earth. The plane climbed gracefully, sunlight flashing across its wings. In seconds, it was just another glint in the wide blue sky. The radio reports began not long after. Hayes's flight had met enemy fighters over the coast. For lightnings against nearly twice as many zeros. Standard odds, standard danger. The air crackled with coded chatter, call signs, bearings, clipped commands. McKenna stood near the operations tent, pretending to work, his hands trembling slightly. Then came the voice, calm, steady, but different somehow. Hayes. Engaged at 13,000 feet. Rolling left. Target down. Another burst of static. Then, engaged again. Immediate response. Controls perfect. 2 targets down. McKenna froze, staring at the radio operator. The man turned to him, wide-eyed. It was working. The Lightning wasn't just surviving, it was outperforming. 17 minutes later, the familiar engine noise returned over the treetops. The P-38 glided down toward the strip, its left wing patched with bullet holes but intact. Hayes taxied in, canopy sliding open, his face pale with adrenaline. He jumped down from the cockpit and walked straight toward McKenna. 2 words were all he said. It worked. McKenna nodded, saying nothing. The sound of the engines faded behind them. For the first time in months, the airfield felt lighter, as if something invisible had shifted. Neither of them could have known that this small, improvised fix would soon spread quietly across the Pacific, a secret whispered from mechanic to mechanic, from one flight line to another. The war in the air had just changed, and no one in the command offices had the faintest idea why. The following morning, the hangar was alive with chatter. Mechanics swapped rumors over coffee, pilots leaned over maintenance logs, and word spread faster than the morning heat rising off the tarmac. Lieutenant Hayes had downed 3 enemy aircraft in a single engagement, something unheard of for a young pilot with no previous victories. The official debriefing said it was skill, luck, and good positioning. But those who had seen the fight from above told a different story. Hayes's P-38 had moved differently, sharper, quicker, as if it had shed its weight mid-flight. Captain Frank Mitchell, one of the most respected flight leaders in the group, had watched the battle from altitude. He couldn't stop replaying what he'd seen. The Lightning wasn't supposed to roll that fast, wasn't supposed to change direction that cleanly. Hayes had done things no P-38 pilot could normally do, things that defied both doctrine and aerodynamics. After landing, Mitchell went straight to the maintenance area and found McKenna kneeling by another aircraft, wiping oil from his hands. Mitchell asked directly, "What did you do to his plane?" McKenna hesitated. He wasn't a man who liked explaining himself, especially to officers. But something in Mitchell's tone wasn't disciplinary. It was curious, almost respectful. McKenna looked around, making sure no one else was listening, then told him the truth. About the slack in the control cables. About the piano wire. About how he'd added just enough tension to remove the delay. Mitchell didn't interrupt. He simply nodded as McKenna spoke. When the explanation ended, the captain asked a single question. "Can you do it to mine?" McKenna froze. 1 modification was already dangerous enough. 2 could turn a quiet secret into a scandal. But Mitchell's face was steady, resolute, a man who'd lost too many friends to bureaucratic perfection. "If it works," Mitchell said quietly, "then it's worth the risk." That evening, under the fading orange light of another Pacific sunset, McKenna performed the same delicate surgery on Mitchell's Lightning. The hangar was hot and still, every sound amplified by the metal walls, the scrape of pliers, the faint ring of the tension cable, the snap of the inspection panel closing. By the time he finished, the stars were out again. The next morning, Mitchell took off for a test flight. Within 10 minutes, the base radio crackled with his voice, loud and astonished. "She flies like a new machine," he said. "Like she's finally awake." When he landed, other pilots gathered around, asking what he'd changed. Mitchell only smiled and pointed at McKenna. "Ask him," he said. That was all it took. By the end of the week, 2 more aircraft had been modified. Then 5. Then 9. The transformation spread not through memos or orders but through whispers in ready rooms and mechanics' tents. A sergeant in another squadron heard about the tension trick and replicated it. A crew chief at a nearby base copied it from memory. No one wrote anything down. Officially, nothing had changed. But in practice, every pilot who flew a modified Lightning came back with a story. Tighter turns, faster rolls, a feeling that the plane was finally keeping up with their instincts. Pilots began to joke that someone at Lockheed must have secretly redesigned the airplane overnight. The reality was quieter, more human. A handful of mechanics, most of them young men like McKenna, were fixing what engineers and officers couldn't see, a flaw hidden not in the drawings, but in the way the machine felt. By late August, the difference was impossible to ignore. The squadron's kill ratio had shifted dramatically. What had once been 2 losses for every confirmed enemy downed was now nearly even. Pilots who had been cautious in combat began flying with newfound confidence. Even the Zero pilots seemed to sense the change. Their once reliable tactics, baiting a P-38 into a turn and cutting inside it, was suddenly failing. American aircraft were rolling faster, reversing direction sooner, turning tighter than before. Still, no one outside the airfields knew why. The official maintenance logs remained clean. The modified planes passed inspections easily because the mechanics removed the tensioners before checks and reinstalled them afterward. It was a secret rebellion, small, silent, and extraordinarily effective. When word of Hayes's and Mitchell's victories reached other squadrons, curiosity turned into quiet envy. crews at neighboring bases began experimenting with their own fixes. Some copied McKenna's wire design exactly. Others adapted it using springs or clips scavenged from spare parts. Each version worked a little differently, but they all shared the same principle: remove the lag, make the lightning respond like it should have from the start. In just a few weeks, the Pacific skies had subtly changed. Zeros that once danced circles around the heavier American fighters now found themselves struggling to predict their movements. Veteran Japanese pilots, trained to exploit the lightning's delayed roll, began misjudging timing by fractions of a second. Fractions that turned into missed shots, then lost aircraft. No one in command could explain the sudden improvement in performance. Reports mentioned increased pilot proficiency and better tactical discipline. But those on the ground knew the truth. It wasn't new tactics. It was a 6-inch piece of piano wire hidden inside a machine built for precision but saved by intuition. McKenna never boasted about it. He kept his head down, continued his work, and watched more pilots return safely than ever before. Every time one of them landed and stepped out of the cockpit with a grin, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not pride exactly, just relief. The kind of relief that came from fixing something that no one else believed was broken. By the time September came, dozens of lightnings across New Guinea carried the secret inside their wings. Mechanics from other islands were writing home, asking for spare piano wire. Nobody knew who had started it. Nobody wrote it down. But across the South Pacific, the myth began to grow. The P-38s had somehow evolved, and now the hunters had become the hunted. By early September, the skies over New Guinea were not the same. What once had been a place of near certainty for Japanese pilots had become unpredictable. For nearly 2 years, the Mitsubishi Zero had ruled the air through precision and instinct. Its pilots trusted their reflexes, every motion of the stick, every twist of the wrist, because they knew how their opponents' machines would behave. They had studied the P-38 Lightning's rhythm like musicians who knew every beat of a song. But suddenly, the tune had changed. It started with whispers in after-action briefings. Japanese airmen returned from missions describing P-38s that rolled faster, turned inside patterns that should have been impossible, reversed mid-fight as if the laws of inertia no longer applied. Their reports sounded inconsistent, almost exaggerated. Senior officers dismissed them at first, calling it stress, luck, or new American pilots who had simply learned to fly better. But the stories kept coming, from different units, from aces who had never once been prone to overstatement. Something was different in the air. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected and experienced pilots, noticed it firsthand. He had flown more engagements than almost anyone alive and prided himself on reading an enemy before the battle even began. On September 3, 1943, during an encounter near Wewak, Sakai spotted a lone lightning below and decided to engage. His tactic was practiced 100 times before. He would dive, draw the American into a turning duel, then reverse direction and catch the slower plane in the open. It was routine, almost mechanical. But this time, it didn't go that way. The P-38 rolled into the turn faster than he expected. Too fast. For a fraction of a second, Sakai found himself staring directly into the twin booms of the American aircraft as it came around to meet him head-on. He jerked his controls, barely avoiding collision. The Lightning's guns flashed past, and before Sakai could recover, the American had broken off cleanly, climbing back toward the sun. It was a perfect defensive maneuver, executed by an airplane that shouldn't have been capable of it. Sakai landed that day shaken, though he didn't show it. His debrief report noted unusually high roll rate and unexpected control precision from the P-38 type. Other pilots filed similar notes in the days that followed. The enemy seemed to have found a way to make their heavy fighters react with the reflexes of lightweight interceptors. Back in American camps, pilots didn't talk much about what had changed either, partly because they didn't want to attract attention, and partly because they weren't entirely sure themselves. All they knew was that their lightnings felt alive now. They could follow instincts instead of procedure. Maneuvers that once felt sluggish now snapped into motion with no hesitation. It gave them confidence, and confidence was its own kind of weapon. The change in morale was immediate. For months, pilots had been taught to avoid prolonged engagements with Zeros, to keep distance and use speed as their only defense. But now, when the enemy turned, the Americans turned too, and found themselves holding position instead of losing it. The doctrine was quietly shifting from survival to competition. The P-38 was no longer the aircraft that ran. It was the aircraft that fought back. Word began to spread through Japanese ranks that something mysterious was happening to the American fighters. Mechanics examined the wreckage of downed Lightnings but found nothing new. The same engines, the same guns, the same airframes. No one thought to check the control cables hidden deep inside the wings. Even if they had, the small piece of wire that made the difference would have looked like any other component. As weeks went on, Japanese flight leaders noticed a subtle but dangerous change in their own pilots' behavior. Confidence was giving way to hesitation. The Zero's advantage had always been psychological as much as physical, the knowledge that it could outmaneuver anything it faced. When that certainty began to fade, so did the aggression that once defined their tactics. Engagements that would have been pursued to the end were now broken off earlier. Pilots returned to base reporting that the P-38s no longer played by the same rules. The statistics told the story before the commanders did. In July, for every Japanese aircraft lost, 2 P-38s had fallen. By September, that ratio had reversed. In squadron briefings, officers tried to rationalize it as coincidence or bad weather. But among the pilots, there was a quiet sense of unease. Something had shifted beneath the surface of the war, something they couldn't explain. Meanwhile, on the American side, McKenna's secret fix kept spreading. Each night, as the airfield lights dimmed and the jungle sounds grew louder, more mechanics gathered to whisper about the piano wire trick. They bent scraps of steel by hand, copied the design, and installed it under the wings of waiting aircraft. Some worked by flashlight, others under moonlight, timing every move between patrols to avoid being seen by officers. It wasn't rebellion, it was survival, passed from one tired hand to another. By the middle of the month, entire squadrons flew with modified controls. Yet officially, no such thing existed. Reports praised improved mechanical reliability, as if by miracle, while the engineers back in California congratulated themselves on what they assumed was pilot training paying off. The truth remained hidden, tucked behind the inspection panels of warplanes halfway across the world. As victories grew, so did the myth. Pilots began referring to the change in tone, literally. They said the sound of the control cables when plucked during checks was different now, higher, tighter, almost like the strings of an instrument tuned perfectly. It was an inside joke among the mechanics. The Lightning had learned to sing. But beneath the humor was quiet respect. They knew what they were doing was dangerous, not just for their careers but for their lives. If one modification failed mid-flight, if one aircraft crashed because of an unauthorized change, the entire secret effort could collapse overnight. Still, they kept going, not because they were chasing glory, but because they had already seen what happened when they did nothing. In the weeks that followed, the invisible 6-inch wire became one of the most consequential inventions of the Pacific War, not designed in a laboratory, but shaped in grease-stained hands under dim hangar lights. And though no one yet realized it, this small act of defiance was quietly rewriting the balance of power in the sky. By late September, reports were piling up on both sides of the Pacific. On one side, Japanese commanders demanded explanations from their veteran pilots who suddenly couldn't outmaneuver the Americans. On the other, American officers sent back glowing summaries about improved kill ratios and enhanced flight discipline. Each report told half the truth. Nobody at headquarters knew that the real reason for the sudden shift lay inside a handful of aircraft in New Guinea. In a fix so small, it didn't even have a name. Japanese intelligence began studying recovered fragments of downed P-38s, hoping to uncover some hidden modification. Engineers measured the wings, checked the engines, weighed the control surfaces. Everything matched the known specifications. To them, the planes were identical to the ones they had fought months earlier. What puzzled them wasn't what they found, but what they didn't, the expected delay. Pilots described Lightning fighters that seemed to react before they should have been physically capable of doing so. It's as if the Americans anticipate our moves, one Japanese report noted, as if their aircraft think faster. In truth, it wasn't thought, it was tension, perfectly calibrated tension. That thin piece of wire hidden deep in the control system had removed a fraction of slack no thicker than a coin. But in combat, where reflexes were measured in milliseconds, that difference was transformative. The P-38's control stick now felt alive, responding instantly instead of echoing behind the pilot's movement. The airplane that once lumbered through turns now sliced through them. Back at Doba-Jura airfield, the change in morale was palpable. Pilots who once dreaded dogfights were now eager to meet the enemy. The atmosphere in the ready room shifted from weary caution to confident energy. Chalkboards filled with tactical notes, altitude assignments, fuel loads, formation spacing, now included small drawings of the Lightning with arrows looping sharply, symbols for turns that were once unthinkable. Lieutenant Hayes, the man who had unknowingly flown the first modified Lightning into battle, had become something of a legend. His 3 confirmed victories on that fateful morning spread through every squadron like wildfire. Pilots sought him out, asking questions, trying to understand how his aircraft handled so clean. Hayes always gave the same answer: ask McKenna. McKenna hated the attention. He kept working quietly, still performing official maintenance during the day while doing the real work after sundown. He was careful, methodical, almost obsessive about safety. Each time he installed the wire, he tested the control tension by hand, listening for that precise metallic note that told him it was just right. Too tight and you'll overstress it, he'd mutter. Too loose and it's no use. The younger mechanics watched and learned, repeating the process on their own aircraft until the sound became familiar to all of them. By the end of the month, at least 40 Lightnings across the Southwest Pacific were flying with the unofficial upgrade. The results were consistent: faster rolls, sharper responses, tighter control. Pilots started competing to see who could perform the cleanest reversals in training flights. Even veteran officers began noticing that the younger boys were suddenly matching or outperforming experienced Zero Aces. Still, the transformation remained a secret from the chain of command. The field mechanics had become masters of subtlety. Before scheduled inspections, they would remove the wire, loosen the cable slightly, and then restore the original tension afterward. The inspection crews, following their checklists line by line, found nothing unusual. It was a quiet act of defiance repeated hundreds of times without a single word of documentation. Meanwhile, far from the front lines, Lockheed's engineers in California were trying to explain the flood of positive combat reports. They congratulated themselves on the aircraft's design, claiming their earlier aerodynamic refinements were finally paying off. They had no idea that a group of enlisted mechanics had improved their fighter with a piece of wire no one in the factory would have ever considered part of the system. For the Japanese, the situation was turning dire. The once dominant A6M0 was suddenly losing its psychological edge. Fighter squadrons reported higher losses, engagements that ended with unexpected reversals, and a growing uncertainty that unsettled even their best pilots. The term lightning turn began appearing in after-action reports, shorthand for the P-38's new ability to reverse direction instantly. Some pilots refused to engage at equal altitude, preferring to dive away rather than risk a close encounter. Commanders at Rabaul issued a new directive: avoid prolonged turning engagements with American twin-engine fighters. That single line, buried deep in an operations bulletin, marked a turning point. For 2 years, Zero pilots had owned the turning fight. Now they were being told to run from it. The shift didn't just affect tactics, it changed the mood of the war itself. For the first time, the Americans weren't the ones adapting to survive. The Japanese were. The skies that had once felt like traps now felt like open ground. Pilots who had once prayed for cloud cover now sought clear air where they could test their machines. And every time a Lightning came back with new bullet holes in its fuselage but its pilot smiling, McKenna felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his unapproved piece of wire had made that possible. But even as the success spread, the danger grew. Too many victories drew attention. Sooner or later, someone higher up would notice the pattern, the identical performance improvements across multiple squadrons. And when that happened, McKenna's quiet revolution would either be recognized or erased. He tried not to think about it. Each night, as he walked back to his tent, the tropical air thick and buzzing with insects, he carried the same thought: if it's keeping them alive, then it's worth it. What McKenna didn't yet realize was that his secret was already on its way to discovery, not by the Japanese, but by his own superiors, whose curiosity was finally being stirred by a pattern that no amount of official paperwork could explain. By early October, the numbers were impossible to ignore. Squadrons flying the P-38 in the Southwest Pacific were reporting combat ratios unseen since the beginning of the war: 1 loss for every 2 enemy fighters destroyed, sometimes better. Commanders reading the reports back at 5th Air Force headquarters in Brisbane were pleased, but also puzzled. The Lightning had always been a fast, high-altitude interceptor, not a close-turning dogfighter. Yet the written accounts from pilots suggested otherwise. Exceptional roll rate, one report read. Control response immediate, said another. The engineers at Lockheed back in California were thrilled at first. They believed their design improvements were finally proving effective in real combat. But the reports kept describing behavior that didn't align with any production changes. No official modifications had been issued, and no new control surfaces had been installed in the field. Still, the planes were performing beyond their documented limits. It was enough to raise questions, the kind of questions that traveled fast up the chain of command. An engineering officer from the Army Air Force's Technical Division was sent to New Guinea to investigate. His job was simple: find out what was happening to the P-38s. When he arrived at Dobajura Airfield, he expected to find pilots exaggerating or mechanics skipping inspections. What he found instead was an operation running like clockwork, aircraft spotless, maintenance logs precise, every checklist followed by the book. Too precise, he thought. McKenna heard about the inspection 2 days before it began. The news spread through the maintenance tents like a warning siren. The mechanics who had been quietly installing wire tensioners for weeks met under the cover of darkness. They all knew what discovery would mean: charges, dishonorable discharges, maybe worse. But removing the modifications altogether would mean sending their pilots back into the air with machines that no longer responded as they should. The idea was unbearable. So they came up with a plan. Before the inspectors arrived, they loosened every control cable to standard specification, removed the wire inserts, and stored them inside toolkits or buried them under crates of spare parts. When the inspection teams plucked the cables, they found the same soft tone that had once haunted McKenna, the tone of a machine that hesitated. Everything appeared normal. The engineering officer checked off the boxes on his clipboard and moved on. Satisfied that the reports of improved control response were simply exaggerated pilot impressions, the officer was preparing to leave when a chance event changed everything. One morning, while walking the line of parked aircraft, he overheard 2 young pilots talking about how tight their Lightnings felt in flight, how they rolled like they'd been rebuilt overnight. The officer frowned, made a note, and quietly ordered one of the planes to be taken apart for detailed analysis. That aircraft happened to belong to Captain Frank Mitchell. The maintenance crew, unaware of the decision, hadn't had time to remove the modification. When the inspection panel came off and the flashlight beam swept the inner cavity of the wing, the officer saw it, a bent piece of piano wire clamped neatly along the control cable, shimmering faintly in the light. He leaned closer, puzzled. It wasn't standard, but it was beautifully done. Functional. Clean. Intentional. He called McKenna over. "What's this doing here?" the officer asked. McKenna paused. The moment he'd been dreading had arrived. Around them, the hangar fell silent. Other mechanics stopped what they were doing, waiting to see how he'd respond. There was no way to hide it, no way to explain it as coincidence. So he told the truth, not the whole story at once, but enough. How he'd noticed the slack. How he'd used the wire to correct it. How the change had saved lives. The officer listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When McKenna finished, the silence lingered. Finally, the officer sighed and said, "You realize this is completely unauthorized?" McKenna nodded. "Yes, sir." "And you understand what happens if this causes an accident?" "Yes, sir." Instead of arresting him, the officer surprised everyone. "Show me exactly how you did it." McKenna demonstrated, walking him through each step, the bending, the fitting, the tensioning by hand. The officer tested the controls himself and could feel the difference immediately. It was subtle but undeniable. When he released the stick, it snapped back with a precision that made the standard system feel almost lazy. That evening, the officer sent a coded message to headquarters requesting an engineering evaluation team from Lockheed. Within 2 weeks, 3 engineers arrived on the island carrying notebooks, calipers, and measuring tools. They spent days inspecting the modified aircraft, taking photographs, and running static control tests. They spoke to pilots, measured cable stress, and compared roll rates. The data confirmed what combat reports had been saying all along. The modification wasn't luck or exaggeration. It was physics. When the engineers finally met with McKenna, they were almost embarrassed. "We should have seen this back at the factory," one of them admitted. "The system design allows too much play under load. You fixed it." McKenna didn't know what to say. He wasn't looking for praise. He just wanted to keep his pilots alive. The engineers drafted a report recommending the addition of a built-in tensioning system for future production models. They noted that the modification was safe, repeatable, and beneficial to combat maneuverability. They didn't mention McKenna by name. His identity was quietly omitted from the final draft, but his work had changed the course of their design philosophy. Meanwhile, the pilots kept flying, unaware that the secret was out. Their confidence was unshaken, their aircraft sharper than ever. The war in the air had tipped again, this time permanently. The Zero's mystique was fading, its legend slowly unraveling at the edges. Back in California, Lockheed engineers began integrating the new system into the upcoming P-38J model. For them, it was a technical improvement. For the men in New Guinea, it was proof that sometimes the difference between defeat and survival came not from headquarters, but from a mechanic working by flashlight in the middle of the night. By the end of October, the change had become official. Lockheed issued a new technical bulletin authorizing field adjustment of control cable tension for all P-38 units in combat zones. The modification, once a whispered secret between exhausted mechanics, was now policy. Diagrams were circulated, replacement parts shipped, and training sessions held to teach crews how to replicate what McKenna and his men had already perfected months earlier. For the pilots, nothing really changed. Their Lightnings already flew the way they should. But the sense of validation spread through every hangar like a warm breeze. The mechanics who had risked everything no longer had to hide their work. For the first time, they could tune an aircraft openly, without the fear of disciplinary action. They were finally allowed to make the machine match the instinct of the man who flew it. McKenna watched the transformation unfold quietly. He didn't speak at briefings, didn't seek credit. The engineering officers and Lockheed representatives moved through the base shaking hands, congratulating each other on the brilliant innovation now improving combat performance across the Pacific. They used words like procedural refinement and control optimization. McKenna stood at the edge of the hangar, arms folded, knowing those words came from desks thousands of miles away. He didn't care about recognition. What mattered was that his pilots, Hayes, Mitchell, and all the rest, were coming home from missions more often. The airstrip, once lined with damaged planes and silent bunks, now echoed with laughter again. The sound of engines warming up in the morning carried a new confidence, not the nervous tension that had filled the air months earlier. Still, McKenna couldn't help noticing how quickly the system absorbed his rebellion. What had started as a quiet act of defiance was now wrapped neatly in paperwork and stamped with approval. Headquarters sent commendations, but not to him. The men who signed the new design never knew the feel of the tropical night or the sound of rain dripping on metal as he worked in secret. To them, the fix was just data, a graph, a memo, a number on a report. But among the crews, the truth remained an open secret. When the first official improvement kits arrived by cargo plane, they found them amusing. The parts were identical to what they had been bending by hand for months. One mechanic held up a new factory-issued spring and laughed. "We've been building this out of piano wire," he said. "Guess they finally learned to listen." Meanwhile, the war outside their island changed shape. American pilots were now flying with confidence, sweeping across the skies in missions that stretched deeper into enemy territory. The once unstoppable Japanese air forces were retreating, their formations thinner with every passing week. Reports from Rabaul and the Solomons described confused air battles where the Zero's agility no longer decided the outcome. The Lightning had grown into its name: sudden, fast, impossible to predict. At high command, analysts credited the victory to tactics, training, and superior logistics. They were partly right. But the people who knew better were the ones covered in oil and sweat on the airfield, the ones who had stayed awake through the nights listening to the hum of insects and the echo of distant engines. They understood that wars weren't won only by strategies drawn on maps, but by the quiet corrections made by hands that refused to give up. McKenna's squadron received several official commendations for mechanical excellence and outstanding field performance. The citation mentioned creative maintenance leadership, but didn't include names. The pilots celebrated with what little they had: coffee, laughter, and stories told under the dim hangar lights. Hayes raised a tin mug and toasted to the men who keep us flying. Everyone knew who he meant. Yet McKenna felt something bittersweet beneath the pride. The fix had saved lives, yes, but it had also changed something in him. He realized how easily truth could vanish once it was convenient for those above to take credit. The official bulletins would go into archives. The reports would be read by engineers who'd never see the men who made them possible. Someday, he thought, someone would open a manual and see a neat diagram of a tensioning system, never knowing it had been born from a drop of sweat and a length of wire bent under a single flickering bulb. As November arrived, the rains returned. The jungle became heavy with the scent of wet earth and fuel. McKenna continued working, still the first man in the hangar each morning, still the last to leave. The war was moving northward now, closer to the Philippines, and soon his squadron would be reassigned. But for the moment, he let himself breathe. The Lightning had become what it was always meant to be, a machine that trusted its pilot as much as its pilot trusted it. One night, Hayes found him sitting on a fuel drum, watching the clouds drift past the moon. The air smelled of oil and rain. "They're saying commands giving out medals for the improvement," Hayes said. "To the engineering corps, I mean." McKenna didn't look up. "That's fine," he said. "They're the ones who'll remember it." Hayes smiled. "We will too." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of generators and the faint rumble of distant thunder. Somewhere above those clouds, other pilots were flying Lightnings, hundreds of them now, each one carrying a small echo of McKenna's idea. It was enough. By December, the transformation had reached every corner of the Pacific. The new production P-38J models, fitted at the factory with their improved tension systems, were arriving by transport ship at island bases from the Solomons to Saipan. Crews unpacked them under blinding sunlight, the smell of salt and machine oil filling the air, and for the first time in the war, the Lightnings were performing exactly as their designers had always claimed they would. They rolled true, turned tight, and felt, as the pilots like to say, alive. But what no engineer in California could have predicted was the way this technical change would ripple through morale. Pilots who had once doubted their own machines began to believe again, not just in the hardware, but in themselves. The whispered phrase, "the plane that sings," spread through every mess hall and briefing tent. Some said it came from the note the cables made when properly tuned. Others swore it came from the way the engines harmonized in flight, the twin booms humming like the strings of an instrument stretched across the sky. Whatever the truth, it became a symbol, not of mechanics or design, but of faith restored. Across the Pacific, squadrons now carried their Lightnings like talismans. Ground crews named them after songs, birds, or women waiting back home. Nose art flourished again, colorful, defiant, human. The P-38 wasn't just a weapon, it had become a character in its own story, one born of quiet defiance and midnight labor. Each aircraft carried within its wings the memory of men who refused to accept good enough as an answer. For the Japanese pilots, the shift felt like an approaching storm that couldn't be outrun. Every encounter seemed to bend toward the Americans now, not because the Zeros were suddenly flawed, but because their opponents had lost their fear. The old rhythm of air combat was gone. Instead of cautious duels, the skies filled with bold, unpredictable moves, dives that became climbs, retreats that turned into traps. Lightning pilots began using maneuvers previously thought impossible for twin-engine aircraft: vertical rolls, snap reversals, split-second loops. Japanese commanders called it the second wind of the Americans. The legend of the singing plane even began reaching enemy ears. Japanese radio intercepts picked up fragments of American chatter referring to perfect pitch and sweet tune. Some intelligence officers interpreted it literally, believing the Americans had installed a new type of engine or propeller synchronization system. The irony was almost poetic. What they imagined as a grand industrial innovation had begun as one man's midnight experiment with a piece of wire no thicker than a finger. Back on the islands, McKenna continued his work, now as part of the official maintenance crew for the newly arriving P-38JS. The war had moved on, but he hadn't changed much. He still checked every plane by touch, still listened to the tone of each control cable as if tuning an instrument. Younger mechanics watched him with respect, unaware that they were learning from the very man whose idea had made their jobs easier. He never told them. When asked how he knew a plane was ready, he'd simply say, "It tells you, if you listen." The Lightning squadrons that once struggled to hold the line were now leading offensive operations. Over the Philippines, over Leyte, over the long chains of ocean and cloud, they escorted bombers, hunted enemy shipping, and struck deep behind enemy lines. Pilots who had once flown defensively now pursued their targets with confidence. Many who returned from those missions spoke of the strange serenity they felt in the air, as though the aircraft itself wanted to bring them home. McKenna's name still appeared nowhere in reports. Headquarters continued to credit the factory-approved improvements and superior pilot training. But among those who flew the Lightning, his legacy lived in 1,000 unspoken acknowledgments, a nod from a pilot after a smooth landing, a mechanic running his fingers across the tight cables before closing a panel, a shared look that said, "We know who really fixed it." Even in official correspondence, the myth crept in. Some commanding officers began referring to their squadrons as the Choir, a tongue-in-cheek nickname for the groups flying the newly tuned Lightnings. One pilot painted musical notes on his fuselage, another scrawled the words "Sing to Survive" beneath the cockpit. It wasn't regulation, but no one stopped them. By then, the Lightning's success spoke for itself. Through the closing months of 1943 and into 1944, the aircraft's reputation solidified. New pilots arriving from the States were told that the P-38 was a machine with a heartbeat. They didn't know how literal that phrase was. For them, the plane's responsiveness was a marvel of modern design, not the ghost of a field modification born in the humid dark of a New Guinea night. Occasionally, McKenna would catch a glimpse of one of those new pilots climbing into the cockpit for the first time. The young men looked confident, almost careless, their uniforms still crisp, their boots too clean. They had no idea that the machine beneath them carried a legacy written not in orders or blueprints, but in the quiet persistence of a few anonymous mechanics who had refused to give up on their friends. And in those moments, standing at the edge of the runway as engines thundered to life, McKenna would smile. He didn't need medals or headlines. Every time a Lightning lifted into the sky with that perfect, singing precision, he knew that the sound echoing across the airfield was enough, the sound of a small idea that had grown into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. When the war finally began to fade toward its end, the Lightnings had already earned their place among the icons of the sky. They had escorted bombers over Tokyo, hunted enemy ships across endless ocean, and survived storms that shredded other aircraft. By 1945, the Lightning's shape was as familiar to Pacific skies as the clouds themselves. Twin booms glinting in the sun, the steady hum of synchronized engines rising like a song that promised victory. Robert Hayes was still flying then. He had grown from a nervous rookie into one of the unit's most reliable combat leaders. 11 victories, 63 missions, countless near misses. The once uncertain farm kid from Iowa now guided younger pilots through their first terrifying dogfights, teaching them to trust the airplane as if it were an extension of themselves. When they landed safely, he'd grin and say, "The trick is, you've got to listen to the plane. She'll tell you what she needs." Few knew that those words came straight from McKenna. When the fighting finally stopped, Hayes returned home. He traded the cockpit for open fields, marrying his high school sweetheart and settling down to work as a crop duster, the simplest kind of flying, but the one that made him happiest. Every August, though, he made a quiet phone call to California. "It's Hayes," he'd say. "I just wanted to thank you again." McKenna would laugh softly on the other end. "Just doing my job," he'd reply. But both men knew it was more than that. Frank Mitchell, the squadron commander who had once demanded the modification for himself, stayed in uniform after the war. He led his unit through the Philippines and into Okinawa, earning commendations for leadership and courage. When he retired in the early 1960s, he made a point of telling every young maintenance officer under his command the same story, about a mechanic who saw a problem, fixed it, and never asked for credit. "Remember," he'd say, "sometimes the right idea doesn't come from the top. Sometimes it comes from the man with grease on his hands." As for McKenna, he stayed in the service until 1946. Then he went home to Long Beach and opened a small garage near the docks. He worked there quietly for more than 40 years, repairing engines, teaching apprentices, and never mentioning the war unless someone else brought it up. To his customers, he was just Jim, the guy who could make any motor run smoother than it had before. To the men who knew his story, he was the reason dozens of pilots had come home alive. In 1991, a historian researching P-38 development came across scattered references to an unofficial field tensioner in maintenance reports from 1943. Curious, he began tracing names and serial numbers until one led him to a phone number in Long Beach. McKenna was 73 then, still working part-time in his shop. When asked about the modification, he paused for a long moment, then chuckled. "It wasn't anything special," he said. "Just something that needed doing." The historian later estimated that McKenna's simple adjustment, that small piece of wire bent into a Z, had likely saved between 80 and 100 American aviators. He tried to arrange for formal recognition, but the records were incomplete, and official memory had long since moved on. McKenna didn't mind. "I remember the ones who made it back," he said. "That's enough." When he passed away in the early 2000s, his obituary mentioned only that he had served as an aircraft mechanic in the Army Air Forces. There was no note of his innovation, no line about the piano wire or the way it changed the course of a war. But in a small office at the back of the garage, a faded photograph still hangs, a young man in coveralls, leaning against the gleaming wing of a P-38 Lightning. On the back, written in pencil, are the words, "New Guinea, August 1943. To this day, pilots and historians speak of the Lightning with a kind of reverence. They talk about its speed, its power, its unmistakable twin-engine roar. But among those who know the story behind the sound, the true story, there's another layer of meaning. They know that what made the P-38 legendary wasn't just its design or its weaponry, but the human touch inside its steel heart. And so, the myth of the singing plane endures, not as a tale of machines, but as a reminder that even in the largest of wars, victory often begins in the smallest acts of courage. A mechanic with a cut thumb, a strip of wire, and a belief that doing what's right matters more than doing what's allowed. That's how history changes, not with noise or glory, but with a quiet note that still echoes through time, as steady and certain as the hum of a lightning climbing into the morning sky.